In this story, you'll learn about the seven wonders of the ancient world, not as distant legends, but as real creations of people who lived thousands of years ago. You'll be transported to the scorching sands of Egypt and witness the pyramids of Giza rising, the only wonder that has survived to this day. You'll visit mysterious Babylon, where people still debate whether the Hanging Gardens actually existed. You will hear the story of the majestic temple of Artemis, learn about the fate of the giant statue of Zeus, and imagine the light of the lighthouse of Alexandria, which guided ships for centuries. This is a peaceful journey through time, about faith, ambition, and humanity's desire to leave a mark on eternity. A story that you can not only learn about, but also feel. Night descends slowly over the desert. The air grows cooler by degrees, and the sand, scorched throughout the long day, begins releasing its stored heat in soft, invisible waves. In this profound stillness, where almost no sound exists, the silhouettes of enormous structures gradually emerge from the darkness. The Pyramids of Giza. Before you stands the Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu, known in the ancient world as Cheops. It was built around 2560 BCE. For more than 4,500 years, it has occupied this precise spot, essentially unchanged. Stone upon stone, layer upon layer, raised by human hands into something that would outlast entire civilizations. It is not merely old, it is ancient in a way that defies ordinary comprehension. To understand what the pyramids truly represent, it helps to imagine Egypt as it was in that era. The Nile flooded reliably each year, depositing rich, dark silt across the floodplain. People cultivated grain, constructed homes from mud brick, and prayed to their gods in stone temples. At the center of this world stood the pharaoh, not simply a ruler in the political sense, but a divine intermediary between the human realm and the cosmos. His power was absolute, his legacy considered eternal. The construction of the Great Pyramid was a matter of profound national purpose. It was not a chaotic or improvised undertaking. Architects, engineers, administrators, and craftsmen all worked according to rigorous plans. Limestone blocks were quarried from sites sometimes dozens of kilometers away. They were transported by water when possible, then hauled overland on wooden sledges, dragged by teams of organized laborers, pulling with ropes across moistened ground. Each block weighed several tons. Some of the granite used in the inner chambers was brought all the way from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers to the south. And yet, step by patient step, these massive stones were lifted and placed with extraordinary precision. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries for how this was accomplished. Straight rams, spiraling rams, systems of levels and counterweights, combinations of all of these. The exact method remains debated, but one thing is absolutely clear. The achievement required organizational genius on a scale rarely matched before or since. It is also important to address a popular misconception. The builders of the pyramids were not slaves in the way that image has long persisted. Archaeological excavations near Giza have uncovered a workers' village complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. Evidence suggests these were skilled laborers, paid workers who received rations, medical care, and even honorable burial when they died on site. Building the pharaoh's eternal resting place was considered a great honor. Graffiti left by work gangs has been found inside the pyramid itself, names and boasts scratched into the stone with evident pride. The pyramid was conceived as a tomb, but far more than a tomb. Egyptian religion held that death was not an ending, but a transition. The soul required the body to endure, and the body required protection. For this reason, the interior of the pyramid is a complex system of chambers, passages, shafts, and carefully engineered barriers designed to foil tomb robbers and protect the pharaoh's remains across eternity. If you could walk inside and trace the narrow ascending corridors, feel the cold smoothness of the limestone walls, and finally enter the stark granite burial chamber at the pyramid's heart, you would find the space almost empty of ornamentation, yet charged with immense intention. What makes the engineering of the Great Pyramid particularly astonishing is its precision. The structure is oriented to the cardinal points of the compass, with a margin of error of less than 1/10 of a degree. Its four base sides differ in length by only a matter of centimeters, despite spanning over 230 meters each. This accuracy was achieved without modern instruments, without GPS, without laser levels, only through systematic observation of the stars, sophisticated understanding of geometry, and accumulated generations of expertise. The North Star served as a celestial anchor. Certain constellations were used to establish true north with remarkable exactitude. The night sky, in fact, held a central place in Egyptian cosmology. Stars were not mere decoration on the vault of heaven. They were symbols of eternity, paths for the soul, and markers of sacred time. The three Great Pyramids at Giza are famously argued by some researchers to mirror the alignment of the belt stars of Orion, a constellation the Egyptians associated with Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection. Whether or not this was deliberate, it captures something true about how the Egyptians understood their monuments, not as mere buildings, but as cosmic anchors connecting the terrestrial to the divine. When the Great Pyramid was newly completed, it looked nothing like it does today. Its outer surface was entirely encased in smooth, polished white Tura limestone. Thousands of casing stones fitted together so tightly that a blade could barely pass between them. In sunlight, the pyramid blazed like a mirror. Sailors on the Nile could see it from many miles away, blazing against the sky. Under the full moon, it would have appeared almost supernatural. A perfect geometric form that seemed to belong to another order of existence altogether. Around the pyramid stood an entire funerary complex, smaller satellite pyramids for queens and family members, a mortuary temple connected by a long causeway to a Wali temple at the edge of the Nile floodplain, bow pits containing full-size cedar vessels for the pharaoh's symbolic journey. Everything was planned. Nothing was accidental. Construction of the Great Pyramid took approximately 20 years. That is the span of a single generation, meaning the men and women who laid the first courses of stone may never have lived to see the capstone placed. They worked and died in the service of something larger than themselves, driven by a faith that what they were building would endure forever. In that sense, it is perhaps history's most successful act of ambition. it did endure. Much has changed since then. Egypt, passed through centuries of glory and decline, was conquered and reconquered, absorbed into successive empires. The white limestone casing was stripped away during the medieval period to build mosques and palaces in Cairo. The interior chambers were robbed of their treasures in antiquity, long before modern archaeology could find them. But the structure itself, the core, the mass, the geometry, remained. Now, thousands of years later, a person stands before it again, not as a builder, not as a priest or a mourner, simply as an observer, a traveler from a world the pyramid's creators could never have imagined. And in the stillness, something shifts in the mind's sense of proportion. Time, usually invisible, suddenly becomes tangible. The pyramid does not rush. It does not age in any way that is perceptible across a human lifetime. It simply exists, as it has existed through the reigns of pharaohs and the rise of Rome and the fall of Constantinople and the invention of the printing press and the moon landings and everything that has unfolded between. There is a kind of peace in that, in the knowledge that some things are built to outlast not just individuals, but entire ages. That patience, skill, and collective purpose can produce something beyond the scale of any single life. The stars appear above. The desert exhales its warmth, and the pyramid remains exactly where it has always been. Night falls differently in ancient Babylon than it does in the Egyptian desert. The air here is heavier, warmer, laden with the scent of water and rich, dark earth. Nearby, the Euphrates moves with quiet authority, a wide, slow river that has given this city its life for millennia. Along its banks, reeds whisper, frogs call from the shallows. This is not the silence of sand and stone. This is a living landscape, dense with sound and moisture. And rising from it, according to the accounts of ancient writers, was one of the most astonishing things the human mind has ever conceived. A towering garden, lush and improbable, blooming in terraces against the sky. The hanging gardens of Babylon. Babylon was, at the height of its power, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world. Its walls were so massive that ancient sources claimed chariots could race along the top of them. Its streets were planned and paved. Its temples rose towards the heavens, the most famous of which, the great ziggurat of Marduk, may well be the origin of the biblical Tower of Babel. It was a city that understood grandeur, that built in the language of awe. At the center of this world, in the 6th century BCE, ruled Nebuchadnezzar II, one of the most powerful kings of the ancient Near East. He expanded the Babylonian Empire to its greatest extent, defeating Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, sacking Jerusalem, and bringing the Jewish people into the famous Babylonian captivity. He rebuilt and beautified his capital on a scale that left contemporaries speechless. The Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant glazed brick depicting lions and dragons, still survives in reconstructed form in a Berlin museum, a testament to the sophistication of Babylonian artisanship. It was this king, according to legend, who commissioned the Hanging Gardens. The story goes that his wife, Amidis, a princess from the mountainous kingdom of Media, in what is now northwestern Iran, was deeply unhappy in the flat, arid plains of Mesopotamia. She missed the green hills and cool forests of her homeland, and Nebuchadnezzar, in an act of either love or political diplomacy, ordered his engineers to recreate those landscapes within the walls of his city. The gardens, as described by Greek historians writing centuries after the fact, were not hanging in the literal sense of being suspended from ropes or cables. The name likely derives from a Greek word meaning overhanging. A better translation might be the terraced gardens, or the gardens that overhang. What the ancient accounts describe is a series of ascending platforms, each one built atop the other like an enormous stepped pyramid, with each terrace carrying deep beds of soil and supporting fully grown trees, flowering shrubs, vines, and cascading plants. Imagine it. From a distance, it would have appeared as though a living hillside had been constructed in the middle of a flat city. As you approached through Babylon's crowded streets, past merchants selling lapis lazuli and cedar oil, past scribes inscribing clay tablets, past the rumble of ox carts, this impossible vertical garden would have risen ahead of you, green and improbable against the pale sky. The engineering behind such a structure would have been formidable. Stone platforms strong enough to support not just soil, but mature trees. Trees whose roots needed depth and whose weight was enormous, required a sophisticated understanding of load-bearing construction. The vaulted stone arches described in some ancient accounts suggest that Babylonian engineers may have solved this problem through a system of interlocking arches and chambers, distributing the weight down through successive levels. But the greater challenge was water. In a hot, dry climate, sustaining a multi-tiered garden of this scale required a continuous, reliable supply of irrigation. The Euphrates was nearby, but water does not climb by itself. Ancient sources describe mechanical systems for raising water from the river to the topmost terrace, perhaps chain pumps, perhaps an early version of the Archimedean screw, cranked by teams of workers in rotating shifts throughout the day and night. Picture that process in the quiet hours before dawn. Workers move steadily at their mechanisms in the torchlight. Water rises through hidden channels, gurgling upward through the structure's interior. It reaches the summit, overflows into shallow reservoirs, and then trickles downward through a carefully engineered network of conduits and gutters, feeding each terrace in turn before draining away at the base. The sound of water would have been constant, a soft continuous murmur threading through the rustle of leaves. In a city of stone and mud brick, this sound alone would have felt extraordinary. And yet here is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. There is no definitive archaeological evidence that the Hanging Gardens ever existed in Babylon at all. This is not a minor caveat. Archaeologists have excavated the ruins of ancient Babylon extensively, particularly since the 19th century. They have found the Ishtar Gate, the great processional avenue, the foundations of palaces and temples. They have uncovered administrative records, astronomical observations, legal codes, and correspondence. But no Babylonian text, no inscription, no tablet, no administrative record makes any mention of a famous garden attached to the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Every account we have comes from Greek and Roman writers: Berosus, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, Quintus Curtius. They wrote about the gardens with apparent certainty, but they were working from sources that were already centuries removed from the events they described, and none of them ever claimed to have seen the gardens personally. This has led some contemporary scholars to propose a provocative alternative, that the gardens may not have been in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, located some 500 kilometers to the north. The historian Stephanie Daly has argued that texts from the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib describe elaborate irrigated gardens at his palace, fed by an impressive network of canals and aqueducts. Over time, she proposes, the Greeks may have conflated the two cities, attributing Nineveh's gardens to the more famous Babylon. It is a theory that remains contested, but it illustrates something important. The Hanging Garden exists at the intersection of history and myth, in that uncertain territories where solid evidence thins and human imagination fills the gaps. If the gardens did exist, in Babylon, in Nineveh, or anywhere, they were far more than a romantic gesture from a king to a homesick queen. They were a demonstration of absolute mastery over the natural world. To create green abundance in an arid land, to force water upward against gravity, to make trees grow where no trees would naturally stand. This was a statement of civilizational power, as bold as any military conquest. There is something in that impulse that resonates across time. The desire to bring nature to places it does not belong, to create a garden in the wilderness, to build a living refuge inside a city of stone. It is an impulse that has never left us. We find it in the roof gardens of modern cities, in the great botanical conservatories of the 19th century, in every courtyard fountain and urban park. The Hanging Gardens, whether real or imagined, are perhaps the oldest expression of that enduring human longing. Now imagine the gardens at night, one last time. The city below is settling into darkness. Torches flicker along the walls. The river moves beyond the gates, indifferent and immense. You climb the steps, slowly, one terrace at a time. The air grows cooler as you ascend. The noise of the city falls away. At each level, the scent of jasmine or cedar or damp earth reaches you. Water trickles somewhere nearby. A leaf brushes your arm in the darkness. You reach the top. Below you, Babylon spreads in every direction, a galaxy of small fires and lit windows. Above, the stars are extraordinary. No wonder they called it a wonder. Whether the gardens existed precisely as described matters less, perhaps, than the fact that people across centuries have believed they were possible, believed that a civilization could build something so delicate and alive that it defied the harshness of the world around it. In that belief, in that aspiration, there is its own kind of silence. The silence of something almost too beautiful to be real. Night arrives gently in ancient Ephesus. The air here is different from the dry heat of Egypt or the heavy, river-thick atmosphere of Babylon. This is the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, where the Aegean meets the land in a soft collision of salt air and warm breezes. The sea is close enough that you can feel its presence even in the dark, a faint coolness threading through the night, carrying the scent of water and distance. Ephesus was, in its time, one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean world. It sat at the confluence of important trade routes connecting the Greek world to the kingdoms of the East. Merchants arrived with silk and spices. Ships unloaded grain and copper in its harbor. Philosophers debated in its streets. It was here, after all, that Heraclitus was born, the man who first argued that everything is in a state of perpetual flux, that you cannot step into the same river twice. Crowds moved through its agora. Languages mingled. Money changed hands in a dozen currencies. And rising above all of it, visible from the harbor, gleaming against the surrounding hills, stood one of the most extraordinary buildings the ancient world ever produced, the Temple of Artemis. Construction of the first great temple at Ephesus began around 550 BCE, commissioned largely through the patronage of Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia. His name has come down through history as a byword for riches. The phrase, "as rich as Croesus," still circulates today, and his investment in the Temple of Artemis was, in part, a statement of that wealth. He donated many of the columns himself, his name inscribed at their base, in a gesture that blended devotion with self-promotion, as royal acts of piety so often did. The goddess to whom the temple was dedicated deserves a moment's consideration. Artemis, in the broader Greek tradition, was the goddess of the hunt, of wild animals, of the moon, and of the untamed natural world. Twin sister of Apollo, fierce and independent, a protector of young women and children. But the Artemis of Ephesus was a somewhat different deity, one shaped by centuries of local religious tradition that predated the Greek presence in the region. She was a goddess of fertility and abundance, depicted in ancient statues with dozens of egg-shaped protrusions across her torso, variously interpreted as breasts, and bull's testicles offered in sacrifice or gourds. Her image was ancient, layered, and deeply venerated. The temple built in her honor was, by any measure, colossal. Ancient sources record a structure roughly 115 meters long and 55 meters wide, longer than a modern football field, wider than many city blocks. It was supported by at least 127 columns, each standing approximately 18 meters tall, arranged in a double row around the exterior. Many of these columns were decorated with carved reliefs at their bases, and the temple's interior housed magnificent sculptures, paintings by celebrated artists, and devotional objects accumulated over centuries of pilgrimage. The Greek architect and engineer Theodorus, who helped design the building, faced an immediate and serious problem: the marshy ground of the site. A conventional stone foundation would have sunk unevenly into the soft earth. His solution was to lay a deep bed of charcoal and sheepskin fleeces beneath the foundation, creating a compressible cushion that could absorb ground movement and distribute the temple's enormous weight more evenly. It was an engineering insight so counterintuitive, burying perishable organic material beneath a monument meant to last forever, that it impressed ancient commentators and continues to interest structural engineers today. To stand before the completed temple in daylight was to be overwhelmed. Marble, white, luminous, quarried from the mountains of Asia Minor, reflected sunlight in every direction, so that the building appeared less to stand in the landscape than to radiate from it. Pilgrims arrived from across the Greek world and beyond, drawn by devotion and by the simple human compulsion to witness something beautiful. They brought offerings, small terracotta figurines, bronze pins, amber beads, coins pressed into the temple's treasury. They came with prayers for safe passage at sea, for fertility, for healing, for the protection of the children. The temple also served purposes that we might today consider secular. Its treasury functioned as something close to a bank. Wealthy individuals deposited valuables under the protection of the goddess, whose sacred status made the temple a relatively safe repository in a world without formal financial institutions. Merchants sealed contracts within its precincts, invoking Artemis as witness. Those fleeing legal persecution or personal enemies could claim sanctuary within its walls. The sacred and the practical were not separate categories in the ancient world. A temple was simultaneously a house of worship, a civic institution, a treasury, a courthouse, and a gathering place. The temple of Artemis was all of these things at once. Then, on a single night in 356 BCE, much of it was gone. The man responsible was neither a general nor a conqueror. He had no army, no political grievance, no theological objection. His name was Herostratus, and he was, by all accounts, an ordinary man, driven by an extraordinary and terrible ambition. He wanted to be remembered forever. Unable to distinguish himself through achievement, he chose destruction. He set fire to the temple in the dead of night, the dry timber of the roof catching quickly, the flames spreading through the interior, consuming sculptures and offerings and the accumulated devotion of 2 centuries. He succeeded in his goal, though perhaps not quite as he imagined. The Ephesian authorities, horrified, decreed that his name should be erased from all records and never spoken again, a punishment the Greeks called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. But the very severity of the crime made silence impossible. Ancient historians wrote about it, copied the story, passed it along. Herostratus became grotesquely exactly what he had sought to be, a name that endured. We have a word for the phenomenon he represents: herostratic fame, the pursuit of notoriety through destruction, and we still use it. The night of the burning coincided, according to ancient tradition, with the birth of Alexander the Great, a coincidence that later writers found too neat to ignore. When told that the temple of Artemis had burned on the night of his birth, Alexander reportedly remarked that it was no wonder, since Artemis had been too occupied attending his birth to protect her own house. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it illustrates how thoroughly the two events, the destruction of one wonder and the birth of a man who would create new ones, became intertwined in the ancient imagination. The people of Ephesus did not accept the loss. They rebuilt. The new temple, constructed over several decades following the fire, was by most accounts even grander than its predecessor. Higher columns, more elaborate decoration, a larger platform raising it further above the surrounding plain. Alexander himself, passing through Ephesus on his campaigns, offered to fund the reconstruction in exchange for having his name inscribed on it. The Ephesians politely declined, reasoning that it would not be fitting for one god to dedicate a temple to another. This rebuilt temple stood for nearly 7 centuries, through the Hellenistic period and into the Roman Empire. Pliny the Elder visited and wrote of it too with unmistakable awe. St. Paul preached in Ephesus and found his message fiercely resisted by silversmiths, who made their living selling miniature shrines to Artemis, a confrontation recorded in the Acts of the Apostles that captures, in miniature, the larger collision between the old religious world and the new. Eventually, the old world lost. The temple was sacked by the Goths in 268 CE, and what remained was gradually dismantled over the following centuries, its marble repurposed for churches and civic buildings throughout the region. By the medieval period, the site had been forgotten entirely, buried under meters of silt deposited by the shifting river. Today, a single reconstructed column stands in a flooded field at the edge of modern Selçuk. Storks nest at its top. Around it, scattered stones barely suggest the outlines of what stood here. There are no crowds, no offerings, no sound of sandaled feet on marble. But the absence is its own kind of eloquence. To stand in that field and understand the scale of what once rose from this earth, a building that made even the most seasoned ancient travelers stop and stare, is to feel time not as a gentle abstraction, but as a physical force. The Temple of Artemis was not built to last, and nothing is. It was built to be beautiful, to be meaningful, to give a city and a civilization a place to bring its highest aspirations and its deepest uncertainties. That it was destroyed twice, and rebuilt once, and mourned across centuries, suggests that it succeeded. Night comes quietly to the valley of Olympia. The air cools slowly, and the sounds of the day, footsteps on stone paths, the low murmur of conversation, the distant movement of animals in the hills, gradually dissolve into stillness. This is not a city. There are no crowded markets here, no harbor noise, no political arguments spilling out of council chambers. Olympia is something rarer, a sacred precinct, a place set apart from ordinary life and dedicated, across many centuries, to a single overwhelming purpose. This valley in the northwestern Peloponnese was, for the ancient Greeks, the center of something that had no real equivalent in the modern world. Every 4 years, the fractious, endlessly quarreling city-states of Greece, Athens and Sparta, Corinth and Thebes, the colonies of Sicily and the settlements of Asia Minor, set aside their conflicts and came here together. A sacred truce was declared. Heralds traveled across the Greek world announcing the games, and for the duration of the festival, warfare was suspended. Men who might have faced each other across a battlefield instead competed in running, wrestling, chariot racing, and the pentathlon, all in honor of the king of the gods. At the heart of the sanctuary stood the temple of Zeus, and inside that temple, something that ancient visitors consistently described as unlike anything else they had ever seen. The sculptor Phidias completed the great chryselephantine statue of Zeus at Olympia around 435 BCE. Phidias was already the most celebrated artist of his age. He had created the colossal bronze Athena Promachos that stood on the Acropolis in Athens, visible from ships far out at sea. He had overseen the sculptural program of the Parthenon and carved the famous Athena inside it. When the people of Elis, the city-state responsible for Olympia, decided to create a statue worthy of Zeus, there was only one man for the task. He was given a workshop directly beside the temple, the remains of which archaeologists have excavated. They found there the clay molds used to cast the golden drapery, the tools of a sculptor's workshop, and in a discovery that felt almost impossibly intimate, a small clay cup with the inscription, "I belong to Phaedius," scratched into its base. The greatest sculptor of antiquity, and evidence of his ordinary working life, sitting in the soil of Olympia. The statue he produced stood approximately 12 meters tall, roughly equivalent to a 4-story building. It was constructed using the chryselephantine technique, a painstaking process that involved building an internal wooden framework, covering it with carefully shaped plates of ivory to represent skin, and then closing it in hammered gold. The exposed flesh of the face, arms, and torso was rendered in ivory, chosen for its warm, slightly translucent quality that resembled human skin in lamplight. The robe, the sandals, the elaborate decorations of the throne, all were fashioned from gold. The result was not simply large. It was alive in the way that great art occasionally manages to be, present in a room in a way that mere objects are not. Zeus was depicted seated on an enormous throne for the simple reason that if he had been shown standing, his head would have broken through the roof of the temple. This was not a structural miscalculation. It was a deliberate artistic and theological statement. The building that housed him was too small to contain him fully. The world itself, the gesture implied, was barely sufficient to hold a god. He held in his right hand a small figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, a reminder that triumph in the games below was ultimately his to bestow. In his left hand, he carried a scepter topped with an eagle, the symbol of divine sovereignty. His expression was calm, not the calm of indifference, but the deeper calm of absolute authority, the serenity of a being for whom nothing is uncertain, nothing is threatening, nothing remains unresolved. Ancient writers struggled to find adequate language for the experience of standing before it. The Roman general Aemilius Paulus, who visited in the 2nd century BCE after conquering Macedonia, reportedly said that Phaedius alone had succeeded in depicting Homer's Zeus, meaning that the sculptor had translated into physical form the divine presence that Homer had only been able to suggest in words. The philosopher and orator Dio Chrysostom wrote that a man burdened with grief or suffering who stood before the statue would forget his sorrows entirely. So overwhelming was the sense of peace it radiated. The throne itself was a work of art in its own right. Ancient descriptions record that it was decorated with paintings by the artist Pananius, Phaedius' nephew, depicting scenes from Greek mythology. Its legs were carved with images of Nike dancing. Sphinxes clutched the armrests. Precious stones were set into the gold. Every surface that the eye could reach rewarded close examination. The interior of the temple was deliberately kept dim. The ratio of windows to interior space meant that the great hall was always in partial shadow, and this was almost certainly intentional. In the relative darkness, the ivory and gold of the statue caught whatever light existed. The glow of oil lamps, the filtered daylight from the entrance, and seemed to generate its own radiance. Ancient visitors reported that the floor in front of the statue was covered with a dark pool of olive oil, kept replenished by the temple's priests. The oil served a practical purpose, humidifying the air to prevent the ivory from cracking in the dry Peloponnesian climate. But it also created a mirror, a still dark surface in which the colossal figure above was reflected. so that in approaching the statue you would first see it doubled, shimmering in the oil below, before you raised your eyes to the real thing. To enter that space, even in imagination, requires a willingness to set aside the modern instinct toward detachment. The Greeks who came to Olympia were not tourists. They were pilgrims, arriving after long journeys, still dusty from the road, bringing the accumulated anxieties and hopes of lives lived in an uncertain world. A farmer praying for a good harvest, a mother seeking protection for a son about to sail to war, an athlete preparing to compete the following morning, asking the god for strength and favorable fortune. For all of them, the statue was not a representation of Zeus. It was, in some profound and literal sense, a place where Zeus could be encountered. The line between image and presence was not sharp in the ancient world. A god's statue was a conduit, not merely a symbol. To stand before it was to stand before something that looked back. This is difficult to fully recover across the distance of 25 centuries and the intervening history of iconoclasm, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and every subsequent effort to separate the sacred image from the sacred reality. But it matters for understanding why the statue was made and why its loss was mourned so deeply. The world that had created it did not last. Greek independence gave way to Roman domination. Then Roman power gave way to new political and religious realities. Christianity spread through the empire, and the old sanctuaries lost their legal standing as places of worship. The Olympic Games, which had been held continuously for more than 1,000 years, were abolished by the Emperor Theodosius in 393 CE as a pagan institution. What became of the statue of Zeus is not entirely clear. One tradition holds that it was transported to Constantinople in the 4th or 5th century CE, where it was kept in the palace of a wealthy collector. If so, it perished there in a fire sometime in the 5th century. Another tradition suggests it was destroyed at Olympia itself when the temple burned. No fragment of the original has ever been identified with certainty. What remains are descriptions in ancient texts, impressions on coins found at Olympia, and small terracotta replicas that give only a faint suggestion of the original's scale and quality. The workshop of Pheidias survived longer than the statue itself. It was eventually converted into a Christian church, a repurposing that has a certain unintentional irony, one sacred space quietly becoming another. Night settles over the valley again. The ruins of the temple are visible in the darkness. Fallen column drums, scattered limestone blocks, the outline of a foundation that once supported something almost beyond imagining. But close your eyes and the temple reassembles itself. The columns rise, the entrance opens into cool shadow. Your steps slow, almost involuntarily, as you move inside. And there he is, seated, still, enormous, and yet somehow intimate. The ivory face in the lamplight, the gold catching the darkness and returning it as warmth. No words are needed. None were ever needed. The whole point was simply to stand here, in the presence of something that made the noise of daily life recede, and to feel, for a moment, the particular peace that comes from being very small before something very large. That feeling has no denomination. It belongs to no single tradition. It is available to anyone who has ever stood before something, a mountain, an ocean, a great building, a face they love, and felt the self grow quiet. The statue of Zeus is gone, but it pointed at something that is not. Night falls on the Mediterranean coast. The air cools quickly here, carrying with it the smell of salt and seaweed and the faint, tarry scent of ships. Waves break against the harbor walls in a steady, unhurried rhythm, not violent, just persistent, the way the sea always is. Stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, and then all at once there are thousands of them, and somewhere out on the water, invisible in the darkness, a ship is making its way toward shore. The sailors aboard have been at sea for days, perhaps weeks. They have navigated by the stars, read the color of the water, watched the flight patterns of birds. They are experienced men, but the sea in darkness is a different creature from the sea in daylight, and the coastline near Alexandria is treacherous. Shallow shoals, submerged rocks, shifting sandbars that have swallowed ships whole. There is no margin for error. There is no second approach. And then, on the horizon, a light appears. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, as the ancient world knew it, was built on a small island called Pharos, connected to the city by a long artificial causeway. Construction began under Ptolemy I Soter, and was completed during the reign of his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, sometime in the 3rd century BCE. The architect was a Greek named Sostratus of Cnidus, who allegedly carved his own name into the base of the structure beneath a thin layer of plaster, knowing the plaster would eventually flake away and reveal his identity to posterity long after the name of the king he was required to honor had been forgotten. Whether or not the story is true, it captures something real about the relationship between great builders and the monuments they leave behind. The structure that Sostratus designed was unlike anything that had existed before. Ancient sources describe it as rising between 100 and 130 meters. Estimates vary, and the precise height will likely never be known with certainty, since the lighthouse no longer exists. But even the most conservative figures make it one of the tallest human-made structures in the ancient world, surpassed only by the Great Pyramid at Giza. For sailors approaching Alexandria from the open sea, it would have been visible long before any other feature of the coastline, a vertical exclamation mark against the flat Egyptian sky. The structure was built in 3 distinct tiers, each set back from the one below it, giving the lighthouse the silhouette of a stepped tower. The lowest section was square in plan, massive and solid, providing the broad foundation needed to resist the constant buffeting of Mediterranean winds. Above it rose an octagonal middle section, more refined in its geometry, and at the top a cylindrical tower that housed the light source itself. The whole was topped with a statue, most likely of Poseidon, the god of the sea, or possibly of Zeus, standing watch over the water. During the day, the lighthouse reflected sunlight using polished metal mirrors, possibly bronze, positioned to catch the sun and throw its light far out to sea. At night, a fire was kept burning continuously, its light amplified and directed by the same reflective system. Ancient accounts claim the beam was visible from distances of up to 50 kilometers, though this figure may be generous. Even at more modest distances, the light would have been transformative. The difference between a dangerous night approach and a safe one, between finding the harbor entrance and missing it entirely. To appreciate what this meant requires understanding just how precarious ancient seafaring was. Mediterranean sailors were skilled and brave, but they operated without charts of any precision, without compasses, without weather forecasting, and without any of the navigational instruments that later centuries would develop. They navigated primarily by the stars and by accumulated knowledge of coastlines, currents, and winds. Knowledge that lived in the memories of experienced pilots and was passed from generation to generation with the kind of care we now reserve for written records. Nighttime sailing was avoided whenever possible. The responsible approach, whenever time allowed, was to find a sheltered anchorage before dark and wait for daylight. But commerce does not always allow for caution. Goods needed to move. Seasons governed the sailing calendar. Ships that fell behind schedule could lose entire trading seasons, with ruinous financial consequences. The pharaohs changed this calculation for the port of Alexandria. It made night approach possible, predictable, relatively safe. It extended the functional hours of one of the ancient world's busiest harbors, and in doing so, it multiplied the commercial and logistical capacity of an already extraordinary city. Because Alexandria, in the 3rd century BCE, was not merely a port. It was arguably the intellectual capital of the known world. The city had been founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, and his successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had made it their project to concentrate the world's knowledge there. The famous Library of Alexandria, established under Ptolemy I and expanded under his successors, was an institution of staggering ambition. A repository intended to collect every text ever written, in every language. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were reportedly boarded by officials who confiscated any scrolls on board, had them copied, kept the originals for the library, and returned the copies to their owners. The library eventually held, by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The lighthouse and the library stood within sight of each other across the harbor, two monuments to the same fundamental impulse, separated only by the nature of what they illuminated. One cast light across the water to guide ships safely to shore. The other gathered and preserved the accumulated light of human thought from across the known world. Together they made Alexandria a place that the ancient world came to, drawn by commerce, by scholarship, by the simple desire to be at the center of things. The lighthouse endured for centuries, surviving the conquest of Egypt by Rome, the slow decline of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the turbulent transitions of late antiquity. Roman emperors maintained it. Arab geographers, writing in the medieval period, described it in detail, noting that it remained functional and impressive well into the 1st millennium CE. But the Nile Delta is seismically active, and the pharaohs stood on an island in a harbor. A series of major earthquakes struck the region across several centuries, a significant one in 796 CE, another in 951, a more destructive event in 956, and a catastrophic earthquake in 1303 that caused severe structural damage throughout the eastern Mediterranean. By the mid-14th century, the traveler Ibn Battuta, visiting Alexandria twice, described the lighthouse as ruined on his second visit, reduced to a shell of itself, no longer accessible, no longer functioning. In the late 15th century, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay constructed a fortress on the site, using stones from the collapsed lighthouse in its foundations. That fortress, the citadel of Qaitbay, still stands today, and divers working in the harbor have found large stone blocks nearby, some bearing carved decorations that are believed to be original fragments of the Pharos itself. They lie in shallow water, scattered by the earthquakes that finally brought the great tower down, visible to anyone with a mask and the willingness to look. The legacy of the lighthouse persisted long after the structure itself was gone. The word Pharos passed into numerous languages as the standard term for a lighthouse. Faro in Italian and Spanish, Fer in French, Faro in Portuguese. Every lighthouse in the world today is, etymologically, a descendant of the one that stood on that small island off the coast of Alexandria. The thing itself is gone, but the name it gave to its function is still in daily use. Night has deepened over the harbor. The water is black and quiet, and the stars are out in force. In the direction of the old island, there is darkness now. The citadel's walls are solid and low, built for defense rather than guidance. But something in the mind's eye persists. A tall light, steady in the dark. Not searching, not moving. Simply present, dependable, exactly where it has always been. There is a particular kind of comfort in that image, in the idea of something that asks nothing of you except that you look toward it when you are lost. The lighthouse did not rescue ships. It did not carry anyone to safety. It only marked a fixed point in a disorienting world and said, "Here is where you are. Here is the shore. Here is the way in." This, perhaps, is what connects all 7 of the ancient wonders across the differences of material and purpose and geography. The pyramids declared permanence. The gardens asserted life against aridity. The temple at Ephesus made beauty a form of devotion. The statue of Zeus gave presence to the ineffable. And the lighthouse said something simpler still, something sailors and travelers and wanderers of every era have needed to hear. You are not as lost as you think. The light is there. You only have to look for it.